Hello everybody, and thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we are going to be going through the discography of Dinosaur Jr., another incredibly important and influential band in the world of indie and alternative rock, and a group that has left some very significant contributions to 80s and 90s music, and then their return, which delivered us 5 more albums from 2007 to the present day. This group has had some very impressive longevity, and they are still touring and putting out quality content to this day, and their influence on independent bands and artists cannot be overstated. And after going back and re-listening to all of their albums, I was actually kind of surprised with how my tier list ended up turning out, and I do think I will have a couple of album rankings on here that might surprise some people and wouldn't be considered the norm, but that's one of the things that I love so much about this group. They have such a diverse palette to choose from, and each album can offer something enjoyable and different to every music listener. So I'm very happy to be covering them for today's episode, and what I'm going to do is go through their 12 studio albums, starting with Dinosaur and going up to Sweep It Into Space, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 12 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have their debut studio album from 1985 titled Dinosaur. At this time, they were still going by their original band name, which was Dinosaur, so this was a self-titled album at the time, but a lawsuit would eventually result in them changing their name to Dinosaur Jr., which obviously no longer made this a self-titled album. But unfortunately, I'm going to give this one a C. Not one of their better albums, in my opinion, and this one would go down as my least favorite Dinosaur Jr. record. Probably not a huge shock to most people. This is pretty widely regarded as their worst album, but every once in a while someone will surprise you and hold it in pretty high regard. But in comparison to their other records, this one really just doesn't do very much for me. Production-wise, this one is very raw and noisy and lo-fi, and stylistically it features this blend of some of those indie and alt-rock sounds, but also incorporates some more of their hardcore and punk elements, which can cause some feelings of disarray and make the mood feel kind of scattered from song to song. The album features 11 tracks, and for me personally, there are 5 songs on here that I find enjoyable, and the remainder of it is pretty flat and uninteresting to me. The opening track, Forget the Swan, I think is hands down the best song on here, and definitely reaches the highs that a lot of future Dinosaur Jr. tracks would reach, particularly in the chorus. It's just got that classic vibey and melodic Dinosaur Jr. sound that gives us that first taste of J Mascis's beautiful sense of harmony and melody, and I think if this album delivered more songs that were in a similar vein to this opening track, it definitely would have made it a bit better. I also really enjoy Pointless. That one has a really cool and dark groove between the bass and drums, and a great song to showcase Lou Barlow and Murph. I also really like Repulsion. That would be my second favorite track on here, and another one in a similar vein to Forget the Swan. And I think Gargoyle and Severed Lips are pretty cool, but I will say, in the grand scheme of Dinosaur Jr.'s songs, none of the tracks on here would be regarded as any of my favorite songs of theirs, but in the context of this album, those would be the high points to me. But I do find a good chunk of this album pretty underwhelming, and I don't think that J Mascis's writing had reached its peak yet in this early formation of the group. So all in all, I think this is a pretty weak first release, but since this is my least favorite Dinosaur Jr. album, we will only be going up from this point on, which is definitely a good thing. But yeah, not a great album in my opinion, so I will give this one a C. Okay, next we have their second studio album from 1987 titled You're Living All Over Me, and I will give this one an S. Incredible album, and in my opinion, such a massive improvement from the first release. For a lot of people, this is their number 1 Dinosaur Jr. album, and for me personally, this is not my number 1. This one falls into my third favorite record from their discography. From a production standpoint, this one definitely still has some similarities to the previous release with that very noisy and raw production style, but from a stylistic standpoint, this is much more cohesive, and the songwriting has significantly improved, And this one is commonly cited as a classic and hugely influential indie and alt-rock album, having an influence on massive musical figures such as Kevin Shields of My Bloody Valentine and Kurt Cobain. This album has 9 tracks, with the first 7 being written by J Mascis and the final 2 tracks written by Lou Barlow, so we get our first taste of Lou's compositional style. The album opens up with Little Fury Things, which in my opinion is about as perfect of an opening track as you can ask for, and would definitely make my list of top 10 favorite Dinosaur Jr. songs. Such beautiful vocal melodies and colorful chord movements in the guitar, just a classic Dinosaur Jr. track. For the remainder of the J Mascis songs, my other favorites would be Sludge Feast, Raisins, and In a Jar. And the closing 2 tracks written by Lou Barlow are both very good. Lou's is in more of a similar stylistic territory to the J songs, but then the closer, Polito, really changes things up with the dark and ominous acoustic guitars and the spacey second half of the track. A really great contrast from the first 8 tracks, and a cool way to wrap up this amazing album. I will say, though, that all of my favorite tracks on here are the J Mascis songs. Nothing against Lou Barlow. I definitely don't dislike any of his tracks on here, but I do find that all of the biggest high points for me happen between the first and 7th track. But regardless of that, I don't think there is a bad song on this album. It's such a huge improvement from the first album, and definitely contains a lot of really standout and exceptional Dinosaur Jr. tracks. And yeah, from front to back, I think this album is incredibly consistent, adventurous, but still cohesive, and an incredibly important contribution to the world of indie and alt-rock. So an amazing album, my 3rd favorite Dinosaur Jr. record. This one gets an S. Okay, continuing, we have their 3rd album from 1988 titled Bug, and this one gets an easy S. Absolutely amazing album, and this is actually my number 1 favorite Dinosaur Jr. record. This one really seems to be kind of all over the place in terms of how people rank it. Some people say it's one of their best, and then I'll see some other people that put it pretty low on their list. But after going back and re-listening to all of the albums, this really was the one that stood out the most to me for a variety of different reasons. So this would be the last album of what a lot of people consider to be the first chapter of Dinosaur Jr., with this being the last album to feature Lou Barlow for quite some time. And despite the tension that was happening within the group at this point, I think they managed to produce their most consistent and enjoyable album of their discography. It has a really great collection of just beautiful and melodic songs with some great stylistic choices from track to track, keeping things very interesting. I love the guitar work. I think it has some of their prettiest chord progressions of any album, and I think this album gives the listener the perfect blend of every great side that Dinosaur Jr. has to offer, with the melodic tracks, the more mellow and peaceful tracks, the heavier and more aggressive songs, and a couple of more mainstream indie rock sounding tracks as well. For me personally too, this album does contain the largest amount of my favorite Dinosaur Jr. songs, so that's another huge thing in its favor. And of the 9 tracks on here, I absolutely love 8 of them. The only song on here I've never been able to get into is track 8, The Post. That one, for whatever reason, just never did anything for me. But I think the remaining 8 tracks are so strong, and there are so many just seriously exceptional songs on here, like No Bones, Yeah We Know, Pond Song, and Budge. Budge in particular, I think, has such an awesome energy and aggressiveness to it that I love so much. The guitars sound massive, and the vocal melody has this really great intensity to it. I also love the turn that this album takes for the closing track, Don't. Hearing them go all in with this super intense and aggressive track, I would say it's probably J Mascis's heaviest vocals of any Dinosaur Jr. song, just letting out so much aggression and giving the album such an awesomely chaotic and unexpected change in mood, wrapping things up on the most intense note possible. So yeah, I really love what they did on here. In my opinion, some of the best songs of their entire discography, and from front to back, their most consistent and enjoyable album. So this is my number 1 favorite album of their discography. This one gets an easy S. All right, next we have their fourth studio album from 1991 titled Green Mind, and I'm going to give this one a B. I've never been the biggest fan of this album. It definitely has some stuff on it that I really enjoy, but I would say it is a pretty significant downgrade from the previous two albums. As I had mentioned, this is the first album to not feature Lou Barlow in the group, and J Mascis is doing almost everything himself on here, covering vocals, guitar, bass, production, and drums, with Murph only playing on 3 tracks. There's 10 songs on here, and I enjoy about half of the album. It's got 5 tracks that I like, and then the other 5 are kind of boring and skip-overs for me. But even the tracks that I like on here, I wouldn't say are as standout and exceptional as any of my favorite songs from the previous 2 releases. The only 2 exceptions I would make for that are the opening track, The Wagon, which I think is definitely the standout song on here, and I would say one of the strongest openers of any Dinosaur Jr. album. And I also really like track 9, titled Thumb. I particularly love the use of the mellotron on this one. Combined with the guitars, it produces this really sweet and delicate sound. The only other tracks on here that I do find enjoyable are Blowing It, Water, and Muck. The tracks I've never been crazy about are Puke and Cry, I Live for That Look, and How'd You Pin That One on Me. I think Flying Cloud is okay, but nothing exceptional. And with the closing track, Green Mind, I think the chorus is really nice, but I find the verses kind of underwhelming. So there are definitely some good moments throughout this, but I do think a good chunk of this album isn't very memorable, and there's only 2 songs on here that I would consider to be really standout tracks, like I said, with The Wagon and Thumb. So personally, not one of my favorite albums of theirs, but still produced a handful of tracks that I do find enjoyable, so I will give this one a B. Okay, continuing, we have their 5th studio album from 1993 titled Where You Been, and I will give this one an S. Amazing album, and this is my 4th favorite album of their discography, and in my opinion, it was a significant improvement from Green Mind. This was the first album to feature the new Dinosaur Jr. lineup, consisting of J Mascis, Murph, and new bassist Mike Johnson, and it would also be the last album to be recorded with a full band until their album Beyond in 2007. We have 10 tracks, all of which are written by Jay, and I think the quality in songs is much higher on this one than it was on Green Mind. It opens up beautifully with the intense and hard-hitting Out There, and then changes gears and goes in a more feel-good mood with Start Choppin', 2 amazing songs that contrast each other beautifully and make for a very enjoyable start to the album. And we see a similar contrasting mood with the next 2 tracks as well, with What Else Is New being a little more feel-good, and then On the Way being more intense and driving. And throughout the remainder of this album, they do a great job of continuing to give us a nice variety of feels and vibes from song to song. I particularly love track 5, Not the Same. I love the stripped down instrumentation and the falsetto vocals. It almost reminds me a little bit of Tom York in some spots, and a great track to put right in the middle of the album. There are 2 songs on here that I don't find super exciting, which are Drawings and the closing song, I Ain't Sayin', but I think the other 8 songs are all just so strong, and the variety from track to track creates a very enjoyable listen that is adventurous but still very cohesive at the same time. So an amazing album, my 4th favorite Dinosaur Jr. album. This one gets an S. Alright, next we have their 6th album from 1994 titled Without a Sound, and I'm going to give this one a B. I've always found this album kind of underwhelming. I think the majority of the songs on here are kind of generic sounding and don't really offer anything very unique that really grabs the listener. With the exception of a couple of tracks here and there that I do really enjoy. This was also a weird time for J Mascis because his dad had passed away while he was writing this album, and obviously that would affect his writing process, and that's understandable. But in the midst of that, I do think he managed to produce a couple of really great songs, particularly the opening and closing tracks, which are the 2 high points for me. Feel the Pain is a really beautiful opener, and another just classic Dinosaur Jr. song, and Over Your Shoulder is such a powerful and emotional closing song about his deceased father, and it wraps the album up on such an intense note and really just pulls at your heartstrings. and this would definitely be a contender for one of my favorite closing tracks of any Dinosaur Jr. album, and would also make my top 10 favorite Dinosaur Jr. song list. I just absolutely love this song, and for me, this is really the saving grace of the album. But other than those two tracks, the opener and closer, the only other songs that I really like are Grab It and Even You, which I think are both also amazing tracks. But it's really just the 4 out of 11 songs that I really enjoy on here. Like I said, I do find a lot of the songs kind of generic and not terribly exciting. But in the midst of that, I think he still delivered 4 really solid tracks, and I do think that those 4 songs are so strong that they do a good job of carrying the weight of a good chunk of this album. So, not their greatest album, unfortunately, but not their worst either, so this one will get a B. Okay, next we have their 7th studio album from 1997 titled Hand It Over, and I will give this one an A. A great album and a big improvement from Without a Sound, in my opinion. And this one is actually Jay's favorite 90s album of theirs, which some people find kind of surprising. Stylistically, this one is pretty wide-ranging with a lot of different feels and vibes from one track to the next, but still very much sounds like Dinosaur Jr. to me, and I think the variety in tracks on this one works well and doesn't feel too scattered or incoherent. It has 12 tracks, and something that has always been interesting about this album for me is that I absolutely love the first 8 tracks. I don't think there's a skip over moment, and I find each song very engaging and unique in its own way. But to me, the last 4 tracks of the album have always lost me a little bit and caused the album to run out of steam for the final section of it. The only track I don't mind in the last 4 is Gettin' Rough, but I also wouldn't say it's as strong of a song as any of the opening 8. As far as standout tracks go, I absolutely love track 6, Alone, and the placement of it is perfect, a great change of pace, bringing us into a slower ballad, but it also has a lot of intensity and great dynamics to it. It's great hearing Jay taking some extended guitar solos, which is something that we don't hear very often. And at 8 minutes in length, it doesn't feel like it drags at all, and it just takes the listener on such an emotional and intense journey, and another one that would make my top 10 Dinosaur Jr. track list. The other standout songs for me on here would be I'm Insane, I Don't Think, and Nothing's Going On. And in general, I think the majority of this album is very strong and consistent. Like I said, it just loses me a little bit for the last 4 tracks, but the opening 8 are so strong that it wouldn't feel right putting this any lower than A tier. So a great album, a big improvement from the previous release. This one gets an A. Okay, moving on, we have their 8th studio album from 2007 titled Beyond, and this one gets an easy S. Absolutely incredible album, and this may surprise some people, but this is actually my second favorite Dinosaur Jr. album. There is so much stuff on here that I love. This was their first record since 1997, so almost a 10-year gap in between albums, and it would also be the first album since Bug to feature the original lineup again with Murph and Lou Barlow. So a lot of exciting things going on at this time for the band, and I think they did a great job of putting out just a rock-solid return album. We have 11 tracks on here with 9 by Jay and 2 by Lou Barlow, and in all honesty, I think the majority of this album is perfect. The blended mood from track to track keeps things very interesting, having some more feel-good tracks against some more sadder and melodic moods, as well as some heavier and more aggressive tracks, and I think the first couple of songs demonstrate those contrasting moods beautifully, opening us up on a nice feel-good mood with Almost Ready, and then going into the very beautiful and melodic Crumble, and then we have Pick Me Up, which takes a more darker and aggressive sort of tone and contrasts the opening 2 tracks very nicely, and that's the general feeling that I get when I listen to this album. I think every track works off of one another very nicely, and for me personally, I think 10 of the 11 songs on here are perfect. The only song I've never been crazy about is Been There All the Time for some reason, but other than that, I think their writing was on top of its game throughout this. I really enjoy both Lou Barlow tracks with Back to Your Heart and Lightning Bulb. I think both of Lou's tracks on here are very strong and probably his best writing of any album, in my opinion. And for the Jay songs, my favorites would have to be Crumble, Pick Me Up, This Is All I Came to Do, It's Me, I Got Lost, and What If We Knew. It's really hard to pick, though, as you can see. Even narrowing it down, I just love so much of this album. It's Me, in particular, I think is a really exceptional and underrated song from this album. I also love the mood and vibe change of I Got Lost, a really pretty and mellow acoustic track with beautiful falsetto vocals, and just a great change of pace to set up the final couple of songs on the album. So yeah, as you can see, I cannot say enough good things about this album. I'm always surprised when people rank this a lot lower on their list, because I really can't find any faults with this album other than that one track that I said I didn't like. But the remaining 10 songs I think are all just so strong and exceptional. I think both Lou Barlow tracks are amazing, and there are some seriously exceptional J Mascis songs on here that would make my list of top 10 Dinosaur Jr. tracks, with songs like Crumble, This Is All I Came to Do, and It's Me. So an incredible album, my second favorite Dinosaur Jr. album. This one gets an easy S. Okay, continuing, we have their 9th studio album from 2009 titled Farm, and I'm going to give this one an A. I know some people are going to disagree with this one because I notice a lot of people regard this as one of their best albums, and while I do think it's very good, I would consider it to be a slight downgrade from Beyond. I would say that this one does follow a similar trajectory to the previous album. It's got 12 songs with 2 written by Lou and the remainder by Jay, and I still think that most of this album is very good and consistent. But for me, I don't feel like this album has as many high points and as many exceptional tracks as the previous album did, or any of the other albums in S tier do. It definitely does have some songs that I think are incredible, though, like the opener, Pieces, as well as Plans, Over It, and There's No Here. And I do think the remainder of the album is good, but I just find that, for me, a lot of these tracks fall more into that category of just, good Dinosaur Jr. tracks, rather than like really standout, exceptional tracks that we get in a lot of their other albums. And I think because it is the album that follows Beyond, naturally I always compare the two, and I think I have such strong and great feelings about Beyond that this album doesn't always completely match up to that, but at the same time, it's definitely not bad. I will say it has a couple of songs I'm not crazy about as well, though, like Friends, See You, and Imagination Blind. But at the same time, I can definitely understand why so many people love this album. I think just for me personally, a lot of the songs don't resonate for me as much as some of the ones on other albums. But at the same time, I think most of the tracks on here are very good, and it does have a couple that I do really love. And it wouldn't feel right putting it any lower than A tier, but I also wouldn't feel right putting it in S tier as well, because I do like all of the albums on S tier a little bit more than this one. But at the same time, certainly not a bad album, and still contains some very good Dinosaur Jr. tracks. So this one will get an A. Okay, next we have their 10th studio album from 2012 titled I Bet on Sky, and I'm going to give this one an S. This is another one that might surprise some people, but I love this album, and this is my 5th favorite Dinosaur Jr. album. With this one, I have very similar feelings that I have to their 8th album, Beyond. The main difference, I would say, is that this one has a couple of more songs I'm not crazy about, but at the same time, I think the majority of this record is very strong, and it does have a couple of tracks that I would regard as seriously exceptional Dinosaur Jr. songs. Like the previous couple of albums, we have 2 tracks written by Lou and the remaining 8 written by Jay. The opening track, Don't Pretend You Didn't Know, is, in my opinion, one of the greatest opening tracks of any Dinosaur Jr. album. I cannot get enough of this song. It's one of those songs I can listen to over and over and over again and just never get tired of it. It's so beautiful, and it has just those classic, pretty vocal melodies and tasteful chord progressions, and would easily make my top 10 Dinosaur Jr. song list. Some other standout tracks for me would be Watch the Corners, Stick a Toe In, Pierce the Morning Rain, Recognition, and the closing track, See It on Your Side. There are 3 songs on here that I'm not super crazy about, with Almost Fair, Rude, and I Know It Oh So Well. But I think the other 7 tracks are so strong that it wouldn't feel right putting this anywhere but S tier. So another great album, some seriously exceptional tracks throughout this. My 5th favorite Dinosaur Jr. record. This one gets an S. Alright, now we have their 11th studio album from 2016 titled Give Us a Glimpse of What You're Not, and I will give this a B. Not a terrible album, and I will say of everything that's in B tier, this would be my favorite from that category, but at the same time, it didn't feel right putting it in A tier, and I do think that all of the A tier albums are a step up from this one, so B did seem to be the only appropriate placing. I think a good chunk of this album, though, is enjoyable, but it's not without its underwhelming moments. This one has 11 tracks, with 9 of them by Jay and 2 of them by Lou, and I think about 6 of the 11 tracks on here are really enjoyable, with a couple of them actually being very high quality and standout songs. Going Down, in particular, I think another amazing opening track. It brought me right in and got my attention, and it feels like a classic vibey and melodic Dinosaur Jr. track with a great energy to it. Be Apart is another very beautiful track. I Told Everyone is a really cool song with a very tasty guitar riff, and another one with a great energy and drive to it. And I Walk for Miles also has similar badass guitar and drum grooves and a great grittiness and aggression to it that I love so much. And I enjoy the final 3 tracks of the album as well, Knocked Around, Mirror, and Left Right. Knocked Around brings the mood and tempo down a bit with these peaceful guitar parts and drum grooves with really pretty falsetto vocals on top of it. Mirror is a nice follow-up track to that, and then Left Right concludes the album with a nice Lou Barlow track that gives us a little contrasting compositional style. A couple of the songs on here that I'm not crazy about are Tiny, Love Is, Good to Know, and I think Lost All Day is okay, but not amazing, and there are a few tracks on here that I do feel that way about, and that's ultimately one of the reasons it got bumped down a tier into B. But regardless of that, at this point in their discography, 11 albums in, I think they're still busting out some amazing new songs like Going Down, I Told Everyone, I Walk for Miles, and Knocked Around. So not their best album, but certainly not their worst either, and this would be my favorite in the B tier. So yeah, pretty good album. This one will get a B. Okay, and lastly, we have their 12th and most recent studio album from 2021 titled Sweep It Into Space. And I'm actually going to give this one an A. This is another one that might shock some people, but I was very pleasantly surprised with this album. I think the majority of it is very enjoyable. It's got 12 tracks, again with 10 by Jay and 2 by Lou, and it feels like a continuation of what they gave us on the previous release, but I think from track to track, this one is more consistent, and while I wouldn't say that every single track on here is like an exceptional Dinosaur Jr. song, I still think pretty much every song on here is good in some way and has something unique to offer. Honestly, the only song on here that I can't get into, and I know this is going to surprise some people, but I've never been a huge fan of Garden. Sorry to Lou Barlow. I know this was one of the singles for the album, and I know a lot of people love it, but I've always just felt like it sounds pretty generic, and nothing about it really catches my ear. Other than that track, though, I really don't have issues with anything else on this album. Like I said, I wouldn't say every song on here is like a 10 out of 10, but I also wouldn't say I dislike any of the songs either, and it does have a handful of tracks that I think are incredible, like the opener I Ain't, as well as To Be Waiting, I Ran Away, I Expect It Always, and Walking to You. I think I Ain't is the perfect opener, I Ran Away was the perfect single, and Walking to You has to be one of the most beautiful and intense choruses of the entire album. So in general, I think this album is very good. I would definitely say it's an upgrade from the previous release, and other than Garden, I really don't take issue with any of the other tracks on here, and they definitely deliver us a handful of really exceptional songs. So not very much to take issue with for me, personally, and after making music for as long as this band has, they clearly still have a lot of great stuff left to give us, and I think that is pretty evident throughout this album. So a very good album. This one gets an A. Alright, we did it. We went through their 12 studio albums, and this is what I came up with. These are my personal takes on each of them. Like I said at the beginning, I do think some of my choices are a little unorthodox and might surprise some people, so I would be very curious to hear your thoughts. But like I said at the beginning, this band has a pretty diverse palette of sounds that can appeal to all different types of music listeners, and through the different phases of this band, going on almost 40 years now of albums being released, it's pretty impressive that they are still putting out as good of music as they are, and their influence on indie rock and alt rock cannot be overstated. They are just one of the most important bands to come out of the 80s, and I am glad that I finally covered them for one of my tier lists. So thank you so much for listening. I hope it was enjoyable, and hopefully you learned a thing or two. And if you are interested, please feel free to check out some of my other tier lists, which will be linked in the description and the comments, and see if there's anything else that you might like. All right, that is it for today. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.